This is maybe towards the worst side. That customers and residents were seeing on the internet or maybe in nearby cities that will remain unnamed. So they have concerns. So city staff started working on an amendment to the Burbank Municipal Code. And based on the community's feedback, the goal of that code change or code amendment was to create a uniform standard to preserve the city's character throughout the city. So the code amendment required stealth design and concealment. Stealth design and concealment. It ensured that wireless telecom facilities don't cause visual and physical obstruction to pedestrians and vehicle traffic, as well as requiring inspections and RF testing. Approve this amendment. And so once the amendment was approved, city staff started working on implementing that amendment through an agreement or and design standards. And so we'll start talking about the design standards first. Now, one of the concerns that residents had was just aesthetics. And so we tried to resolve that with these design standards. This is a before and after picture of a recent installation in Pasadena. And you can see this is considered a fully concealed design. And so what they have is the antenna that's in a standard also requires before and after. The next concern residents had was the obstruction in the sidewalk. And so what you see here is a picture on the left is a picture of a service camera. And that provides electricity to any component or anything in the public right-of-way that requires power. And the purpose of that is to protect the system, the wires, to isolate and disconnect in case someone wants to work on the service and wants to do both safely. For this box is to provide capability, so we could build them just as we build everyone else. And so staff looked at the requirements at hand with the wireless telecom facilities, and they require very little power compared to just any other service, including a home. And so what staff did was we looked at our standard for street lighting, which really requires a little box and a breaker inside. And that's what we decided to do with these services. And so to provide the protection and isolation means we just put on an existing pole, we'll go ahead and put the little box, and that'll be our protection. As far as metering, so instead of having a big meter, this is a small meter that does exactly that. It's just very limited on what it can do, but because the service is so small, we can use this. And because it's so small, it can fit into locations like up there. And so with these two devices becoming standard, we eliminate the need for having that box in the sidewalk. And so that means that we're eliminating the public right-of-way clogging or obstruction. So as I mentioned before, the Burbank Municipal Code change is implemented by an attachment agreement, and this agreement has a non-exclusive attachment rights to the carriers, as well as a 10-year term for each site, and a 3-term and the option to extend. that permit is done. The agreement also talks about the installation, removals, emergencies, as well as operation and maintenance. It also talks about fees, and fees to make sure we recuperate the cost of service. And so with that, while staff was working on this attachment agreement and the design standards, the FCC put out a ruling on September 5th, 2018, and I took a little snippet. I'm not sure if this budget will back there, but it's generally what they're saying is 5G and infrastructure, they have plans for it to be everywhere, and they don't want cities hindering that process. They don't want to drag it out, and so that's the gist of the issuance. Again, there's the address right down there for that off of the FCC's website. This is one of the documents I will be sending you if you put in your email and you opt into the emails, so that'll be nice reading 100 pages. It's really the FCC's way of saying, hey, this is what we think about 5G and where it's going. The ruling also talks about limiting fees on charging the state and local governments, talks about aesthetics and underground requirements, as well as establishing new shop clocks. And those shop clocks are for cities to, once carriers put in the application, there's a certain amount of time where the application is complete and it has everything that's required. It needs to be approved within that shop clock. And again, another little quote about what FCC is concluding as part of this rule. And so with that, on February 28th, we'll have another community outreach meeting. It'll be the exact same meeting as this, with the exception that if there are any questions that we cannot answer in this meeting, we'll have the answers for you on the 28th. And also as part of the 28th meeting, we'll have an FAQ sheet, a frequently asked questions sheet, along with the answers, and we'll hand those out based off of the questions in this meeting. Also, if your email is there, I'll go ahead and send you that FAQ sheet as well. After the outreach meeting, we'll be putting this item, the agreement, out for City Council for approval. And with that, we're going to go ahead and open up to questions. We'll start with the cards that have been put in. Dan Rosanelli.
Hello, good evening. My name is Dan Rosanelli. I work for AT&T. I'm an area manager working on our small cell implementation. And I just wanted to introduce sort of our projects. So the correspondence we've had with staff, we've been working with staff now for about a year on standards, choosing locations. We're excited. We're trying to bring 5G into the city of Burbank. And a lot of you guys are here 5G, you don't necessarily know what that means, right? Right now, your phones tell you you've got 4G, right? 5G is the next iteration. You have 3G, 2G, now you're going to bring 5G. 5G brings much quicker speeds to your phones, to your devices. It allows connected devices, cars, tablets, all sorts of other equipment to operate at a much quicker speed. From a latency perspective, data speeds are important. So in order to do that, AT&T, as with most other carriers, we're going to start installing small cells in most cities in areas that have dense populations. So Riyadh mentioned earlier that we're looking to place these sites in order to expand capacity coverage. And those are going to be in areas where we have a lot of users, right, that are subscribers using our devices, are using our service for their devices. We've got macro sites that are existing in your city. There are some coverage deficits in certain areas. I'm sure you guys are aware of. Small cell will help to some extent in those areas. We're going to be using that to help alleviate those issues. But the primary focus is to go ahead and alleviate these capacity issues, which is due to data usage. So, and to get 5G and higher data speeds, we need to bring these things to those centers of densely populated areas. We've got a couple different designs that we've been working on with the city that I think we can share maybe later on, maybe the next meeting or so. Or,
if you want to bring slides, we can.
Yeah, maybe we might do that just to help out. But we worked really hard with the staff. You guys have been formulating new guidelines. We've got some really slick designs that we feel are really well fit for the city of Burbank. We're just excited to bring this technology to you guys. So happy to be here tonight. We'll be around for any questions if you guys have any more.
All right, thank you. Next speaker is Daisy.
Hello, good evening, everybody. My name is Daisy Wickenpack. I'm a municipal engagement partner for Verizon Wireless, and basically here to just be present and listen to the concerns and questions that the city residents of Burbank may have for us. We're excited to partner with the city as far as trying to build small cells in order to build a better network for you here in Burbank. And basically, we're looking at different designs as well to try and make sure that we fit within the aesthetics of what your city is looking for. So if you have questions, we'll be here to answer that as well.
Thank you. Ara?
Sure, I'm on camera here because there's a lot of people that are concerned about what's going on. My name is Ara Manukian, and I'm a business owner in Burbank as well as a resident. We've been doing a lot of studies on the effects of these networks and RF in general and the radiation that they give off. And there are communities within California who have opposed 5G for various reasons. There's health reasons, safety reasons, and environmental reasons. Sadly, as you have heard, the FCC regulates communication. And so our city council and our city cannot oppose things related to health because that's covered under the FCC. When they present their plan to the city council has to assume that it is healthy because the FCC says it's healthy. But there have been recent studies in Europe and in the United States which have shown that there are health risks. We can't talk about that though. Well, we can talk about it at the city council, but we can't actually do anything about that. So there are safety issues and there are environmental issues also that are involved with 5G and the radiation that they give off. I don't know if anybody has noticed in the last couple of years, I used to have a real problem in Magnolia Park with birds causing messes on my car. We don't have that many birds anymore in Magnolia Park, as well as bees. And this is one of the effects that radiation RF actually does have. And I believe that before we allow something like this into our city, a study has to be done on the effects. And not a study as in the United States, how it's usually done is when we find out something is bad, we can pull it. We let it go through until we find out it's bad. Where in Europe, they have to prove that it's not unhealthy before before they allow these things in. So I would strongly recommend to the city and to the people especially in Burbank that live here that we oppose this until such time as it's proven that this will not have an adverse effect on our health, our environment, and the safety of our city. We've started a website. It's called no5g.com. You can visit that. Currently, it is going to a Facebook page where we've posted videos from these other cities. For instance, the cities of Mill Valley, California, they just prevented temporarily 5G from being put in residential areas and within a certain 1,500 feet or 2,000 feet of residential areas. There's another city of Fairfax, California, and they have opposed 5G. And there's testimony from people that have presented studies that show that there are possible health risks involved. But again, as I said, and as it's correctly said, was said even by their city attorney, I believe it was of Mill Valley, that the FCC does regulate all that we don't even have a say in. So there are things we can do to prevent it, but we have to decide as a community whether we want 5G or not. We can oppose it if there is a need for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So before we go to the next card, Jonathan is here as a bit of a technical expert, and without really speaking to the judgment of health, I think maybe Jonathan, you can talk to at least the methodology of how they set limits.
Thanks. Good evening, folks. I'm Jonathan Kramer. I'm an RF engineer by training. I became an attorney later in life, and I now teach law and regulatory policy at the university level. I was at the FCC as a government advisor to the FCC during the time when the commission was developing its rules and developing information to explain its rules. So give me just a couple of minutes. I'm going to talk to you about what is legal, and then I'm going to talk to you about how that actually works in real life. Now, to start, I think Mr. Manukian stated it correctly. The FCC has set national standards. But let me step back a second and talk about how those standards were set, why they were set. In 1996, in the Telecom Act, Congress saw that there were a patchwork of standards around the country. This said the city set a standard for the city had a different standard, and there was no national consensus. Congress, as part of the Telecom Act rewrite, said, you know, we need to have national standards. And as the expert agency for telecommunications, they delegated that authority to the FCC. And the FCC came in and started looking at what were the standards in the US, what were the standards in other countries, what did the radiological health officials and experts say about RF, and they learned a bunch of things. Number one is that, first off, there's no single number for RF safety. And the reason is that RF safety is based on frequency and power primarily. The reason is because when we're dealing with RF safety, it's how does it affect us as humans? And because we're big bags of water, it turns out that our bodies absorb RF more efficiently at certain frequencies as opposed to others. So the FCC said, okay, if we know what our bodies absorb RF and how they absorb RF, they actually set the lowest amount of permissible RF for that portion of the spectrum where our bodies most efficiently absorb those signals. And there are other portions of the spectrum where our bodies don't absorb the signals as efficiently, so they have a different standard. So the standards are based not just on frequency and not just on power, but based on the effect that they have on us. Now, when we're talking about RF, it's important to differentiate this type of radio frequency signal from, for example, X-rays, things that cause DNA breaks. At the frequencies that the wireless companies operate, the things that we're involved with here at the city, the effect is not DNA. It doesn't cause DNA damage. So the effect is actually heating. It causes a measurable rise in heating at certain power levels. And let me now step back and say, now that's kind of the background. So the FCC looked at all of the standards around the world. They looked at what the radiological health officers told them, and they came up with a standard. The standard is for the United States, similar to around the world. It's generally about the same. There are some countries that have a tougher standard. By the way, do you know what the effect of a tougher standard is on the number of cell sites? The lower the emissions from a cell site, the more cell sites you have. Because it means they have to put out less power for each cell site, so you end up having more cell sites. So the FCC did a balancing act, and they said, okay, what's the median here, and what are we trying to achieve? And they wanted to have a margin of safety. Now, they wanted to have a margin of safety between the maximum signal that we as public could be exposed to, and not even know that we're being exposed to it, and the point where you could actually measure a change because of RF. And so the FCC said, well, we know at this level, this will cause a change that we can measure, cause heating. By the way, how many of you have 1,000-watt transmitters in your home? None of you have microwave ovens? See, microwave ovens operate on similar frequencies. And we know that containing an RF signal of very high power will cause heat. So it's the same thing, except microwave ovens are not cell sites. The fact that you should know is that the FCC set its 100% exposure limit for the public at 2% of the level where heating occurs. So there's a built-in safety margin of 50 times. Interestingly, 5G has an impact in this discussion. Let me now bring it home to 5G. 5G requires that the average power per cell site actually be reduced because 5G operates on the principle that you want to constrain the coverage of the cell site to a relatively small area of roughly up to about 500 feet from the cell site. So to do that, they actually lower the power level. So when we're dealing with 5G types of sites, we're looking at power levels that are roughly 1% or less of the maximum allowed by the FCC. And that maximum is only 2% of what causes a measurable change in us. Now, is this a satisfactory answer? To many people, it's not, and I get it. They're concerned about RF. Certainly, I think it's fair to say that Mr. Mnuchin is concerned about RF. But now that I've given you the background on it, now let me tell you the legal position the city is in. When Congress delegated that national authority to the FCC to set the standards, they reserved to us the right to check, to determine whether a cell site actually complies with those standards. And in fact, in the proposed rules, there is a mechanism to do that. But we are not allowed to adopt our own standards. We're not allowed to say, well, we're concerned about the health effects, therefore we're not going to allow it. Because just like the city expects the residents to follow the laws and the state expects the city to follow the law, the FCC and Congress expect that the states and cities are going to follow the laws that they set down. So to ask the city council to not approve a site where that site demonstrates compliance or plan compliance, depending on the status of the site, is really, it's not something the city council can legally do. This is the unsatisfactory point. At least if you know that the health standard is set at 2% of the point where you can actually measure a change, that's great. To understand that the city council has its hands tied, it does. So this is the regulatory environment we operate within. And that's why the city in its proposed regulations goes as far as we can legally to ensure that the sites comply with the FCC rules and we don't overstep that authority. So that's kind of the broad stroke. And I know a number of you are concerned about it and happy to talk with any of you about it, but at least now you have a sense of where RF safety falls within the scope of this entire discussion. The rest of the discussion is about the provision of service. The health concern is something that attaches not just to 5G sites, but every wireless site in the city, and this is the scope of it. So, with that,
Thank you, Jonathan. And as Jonathan indicated, the council, each time we revise the regulations, I can't even count how many times we've done it. First, we did it for private property. We don't really have any carriers providing wireless service from the right-of-way today. They're all on private property or on public property on tall structures. There's a few site leases. So this will be new. So in 2017, after a fairly notable appeal of a private site, the community was concerned about the right of telecommunications carriers to install in the public right-of-way. And so the council really reaffirmed the concern for making sure they fully complied with the requirements imposed by the FCC. And so the carriers are required to provide their tabletop estimates, which they do when they design a site to know what their power can be and what the impacts would be. We require them to do a post-activation. Once they install all of their equipment, they have to do a test and they have to prove that they're in compliance. And then the council added in 2017 a requirement that the carriers do a follow-up check every 5 years on every installation to show that they are still in compliance. And that would also wrap in, though not explicitly for any carrier's individual permit, it includes cumulative, because the carriers always have to consider cumulative emissions for all their sites. So if you see one of the larger sites, when it's first installed, it's got 1 row of panels, and the next year it's got 2, and 5 years later it's got 3, they all have to comply and make sure that they continue to comply. And then the council made sure, and the residents required that that be an independent engineer, so that there was somewhat of an arm's length expert doing that analysis. That's as far as we believe we can go without trying to dig in and establish standards, which the federal law precludes the city from doing.
Correct.
The council does require the initial estimates, the follow-up tests, and the 5-year tests. Jeff, I don't know.
That's a lot to have heard about radio frequency emissions, so I'll do my part quickly. Because tonight we're talking about the contract that is under consideration, or will be under consideration by the council next month, I wanted you all to know that in addition to what's already embedded in the ordinance, the contract itself has a special provision that speaks specifically to radio frequency emissions analysis, when it must be conducted, when it must be updated, when the information from that study has to be made available. And there are a number of reasons for doing that. For the staff, particularly the Riyadh staff in the room, some of that is for occupational health and safety. You have members of BWP that are going to be working on these poles because they're BWP's poles. And we're going to want to make sure that the information about how far away you're supposed to stay from an antenna is available for those folks. So it is covered in the agreement, section 3.10 of the agreement.
Thank you.
All right, with that, are there any other questions?
I'd just like to add one thing, sorry. Thank you for your presentations. One thing that I would like to add is that those videos that we've posted on our site from Fairfax and from Mill Valley, everything that was said tonight, for the most part, the residents there found legal loopholes to prevent, for instance, the towers being put on the city right away because they belong to us, so we can't oppose that. And the other one was about the FCC tying the city council hands. They actually found another legal loophole where the city council, if they choose to, and if there truly is found to be some sort of risk to us, and it's necessary to at least delay the installation until we can find out whether truly there is a risk, they can oppose it, and they can be sued by the FCC, the city council. But then we get a jury trial, and through a jury trial, we can challenge the FCC law and have it changed that way. So that, in fact, one of the cities there, I believe they may be taking that route, but that's something else we can explore. So it's not that this contract can be approved or disapproved at this point. It's a matter of, if we want to oppose it, we can put up an opposition if we find it necessary, because we feel that there's a health risk, a safety risk, and an environmental risk to our city, and we can work on doing that. So I encourage everybody, again, to visit no to5g.com. Right now it's forwarding to a Facebook group page, so if you're not on Facebook, you're going to get a message saying that it's blocked or there's some sort of error. Eventually we will get a proper site so everybody can log in there and get information. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? I'll bring it to you.
I just wanted to ask, are these small cell towers going to be implemented in residential areas or only in concentrated industrial, commercial areas or near schools? And how does that work? Like, I saw that you had it on the light pole, but where I live, we don't have standard light poles up in the hills. We have the short ones. So are they going to put them on the utility poles that are in my backyard, or how's that going to work?
So I'll address the question first, and then Riyadh can follow up, or Sven can follow up, because it's really a two-parter. So state law gives telecommunications carriers the right to install their equipment and operate their facilities in the public right-of-way. subject to the city's fair, reasonable time, place, and manner requirements. So that applies to every street, every sidewalk, and the alleys. The city has the ability to regulate the time, place, and manner, primarily around aesthetics and also the operation of the right-of-way, the convenience of the right-of-way. And so, for aesthetics, the council requires that they must go in as a fully concealed replacement streetlight. So that's generally the location they will be, but Riyadh can clarify technically why not all street lights are candidates. Secondly, the council heard the community's complaints about the proliferation of utility boxes. There's internet TV boxes, there's cable boxes, there's water facility boxes, there's traffic control boxes, all of which are necessary, but also sit in the right-of-way and have been considered clutter by the residents. So these standards for this one type of structure eliminate, where possible, those type of utility boxes. Both the ordinance and the agreement, primarily the ordinance, provides that if a carrier wants an exception from the standard, they must make the case that our standard is technologically infeasible, and then the city can hire outside experts to go through their data and make sure that they've actually met a burden, that they can't comply. So yes, as to all streets, both residential neighborhoods, our ordinance permits one per average street block face. So that's one on each side of the street per street block face. And I'll let Riyadh address the issue of, can they go on every street light in town?
Right, so thank you, Joe. If you notice our street lighting system, we have all different types of street lights, but it's not only the shape and size of the street lights, also what kind of power they consume. So some of these lights, we give them 120 volts, which are your typical, maybe 80% of the city is 120. But the rest, you have either 480 volts or series circuits. These cannot go on series circuits, they cannot go on 480 volts. Just the way we control those circuits is totally different than your typical 120 volt circuits. Also, the smaller lights, we can't fit any of these on there. I mean, they're there because they're aesthetically pleasing, they're considered low level lights for pedestrians. So those physically, we can't put any of these signs on there. And so that sort of limits what they could do on the street lights. And then I believe they'll need to make a case for a coverage gap, and that's when they can potentially put in their own pole type.
Their own pole, or there's the possibility, sorry, I think I cut out late here, cut in late. They can go on their own pole, potentially, or they can also locate on a traffic signal pole, which are relatively tall and at every intersection, but they would separately have to meet public works requirements because those poles have a lot of equipment on them. I mean, they have the arms with the traffic signals, and there are a lot of structural issues about adding additional load. So those are possibilities.
So you're saying that they're gonna be in all the residential areas, and if they can't get it to fit on whatever the light is there, they're gonna figure out a way to get it in your neighborhood their own way?
So that's up to them, but the ordinance and the law allows them to go in the right of way. So we're restricting them as to how is a replacement street light or traffic signal pole. And this has been a moving target. Last fall, when we started this agreement, there was a bill approved by both the state Senate and Assembly sitting on the governor's desk that would have required cities to take these installations on every single piece of vertical infrastructure that the city owned, which was an incredible overreach. Ultimately, the governor vetoed it 5 minutes before his deadline, or it would have become law. So that was quite a showdown, and the landscape keeps changing. So this FCC order was birthed and delivered at the same time we were working with the carriers to try to implement an agreement that carried out the requirements of our ordinance.
Thank you.
Jeff has additional comment.
I just wanted to put a little context around this. First, the rules that Joe's talking about have to do with the 2017 amendments that were made by the City Council to the ordinance. The agreement that's going before the council next month, just to frame it, incorporates by reference all of those rules. It doesn't change any of them. In fact, it indicates that carriers are going to abide by those rules. Now, those rules do say that facilities can go on poles in residential neighborhoods, one per block face, standard size block face. That's what Joe said. I wanted to also explain, you had a follow-up question, which was, well, does that mean that they're going to be able to go in every residential neighborhood and they'll be able to put up their own poles if there aren't otherwise poles available? And the short answer to that is maybe. Historically, the courts have said that in order for somebody to have an absolute right to put up a new pole, they had to demonstrate a significant gap in coverage, and that what they were proposing was the least intrusive means of fulfilling that gap, right? It's a test that's been in place since 2001. One of the things that the FCC did when it adopted its new order, which is now effective, is it just basically round-filed that test. That test was actually a fairly workable test. It was going to require an affirmative demonstration about coverage situations and whatnot. Now the test has been changed, and frankly the bar has been lowered. And it is now, I wish I brought my reading glasses. It is whether the regulation materially limits or inhibits an entity's ability to compete in a balanced legal environment for a covered service. So we're not looking at coverage anymore, we're looking at competition. It's a paradigm shift where, and the FCC has said, we're not so interested in whether there's a coverage gap anymore, we're interested in whether this is material to the carrier's ability to compete in a balanced legal environment. What I can tell you that's different than what it's historically been. I can tell you I think the bar is lower because that's absolutely what the FCC intended, and I can tell you that there's no court anywhere that has interpreted exactly what those words mean. So I would expect that's a long-winded lawyer's way of saying, yes, you are going to see more pressure, more opportunity, higher likelihood, depending on the carrier's sort of coverage objectives, more likelihood that they are going to pursue facilities in neighborhoods, and when there aren't existing poles, they're going to pursue putting up their own structures in the public rights of way.
I've heard a lot of indirect discussion about the effect of RF and analogies to things like a microwave. But I think most of us don't run our microwave 24 hours a day. And so what I'm interested in is objective data on what sort of increase or distribution differences there would be in RF, maybe mapped to locations around the city, or where an individual installation would be. I think that's what we really care about if we're interested in that issue. It's not sort of abstract analogies that don't map to actual use, but what would impact be actually the transmission tower of this.
Well, again, Congress tells us that if it complies with the FCC's rules, there isn't an impact that we can consider. So the locations and so forth, that's a different discussion. But as for the impacts, this is based on whether the site complies with the FCC rules, and that's really where we have to stop.
I understand the city's position on that from a legal standpoint, but from a personal standpoint, where can I find the information and make decisions for myself?
I can only suggest that you look at online and follow resources there. We can't make any specific recommendations as to specific documents or so forth, because again, our standard has to be the federal standard.
Thank you.
A question that I hope is relevant. Suppose I have equipment at home that's 5 or 6 years old, and all of a sudden we go to 5G. Is there a compatibility issue? I have, say I have an iPhone that's an i6 or i5 that's 8 years old, and I have a Samsung that's 6 years old, and all of a sudden it's a 5G network. does that impact my equipment? Is my equipment compatible to 5G?
Jeff just said he wants to know the answer to this as well.
Well, most AT&T phones now say you're on 5G.
Okay. All right, so I'm now speaking as a radio frequency engineer with about 40 years of experience. I harken back to when 4G was deployed. It was first deployed by T-Mobile, which put out a press release saying the network is 4G. And then a few weeks later, Verizon said their network was 4G as well. So what are these Gs that we're talking about? And the difference between 4G and 5G easily is 1G. But what does that actually mean? First off, can your old iPhone work on the network? It will say 5G. But if you look at that, it's really a marketing term because the 5G standard is actually not fully adopted yet. And the technology to truly do 5G doesn't exist. I think there are two phones that actually support genuine 5G. So what you're looking at is a marketing term. You've heard about AT&T deploying 5GE. Sprint says it's really not 5G. Most of the equipment that we have today will not effectively use the new spectrum. Doesn't mean that should stop the deployment because you got a chicken and egg issue. But if you recall back in really the last analog phones were in the 3G era, and then we had a transition point where over a couple of years, if you didn't replace your equipment, your phone stopped working. And phones now are backward compatible, so you may see 5G on your phone, but it may only be at 4G speed. So as an engineer, I wish that we had true 5G capacity because it's faster. And really that's the difference from a user perspective. At the end of the day, the difference between 3G and 4G, 4G and 5G is, does it take 15 seconds to download a movie or 5 seconds to download a movie?
Does it matter?
And for some consumers it matters, and for some it doesn't. But this is because we have so many other things that are using the network. It's not just our cell phones, but as was alluded to earlier by AT&T's representatives, cars are actually tremendous consumers of data and other things. So there's more to the network, and there's devices that are being planned to be deployed that we'll have in our homes that will use fast connectivity. Whether you want to call it 4G or 5G, we're switching over to where more stuff is being sent over the air to us and from us back to the network. So it goes beyond the phone, but that's kind of a framework. To answer your question in a long way, your phone will say 5G, and it's a great marketing term.
Thank you.
What is the operative definition the industry uses to define a small cell? What typical frequency would it operate on? What would be the rate of transmit or output power? And what would be the effective radiated power of the antenna array? And how do you account for the cumulative field strength blanketing, let's say, a 1 square mile area when you may have 15, 20, 25 small cells in it?
The first part of your question is very easy to define. What is a small cell, small wireless facility? The FCC chairman has consistently called them pizza boxes, but they're a little bit larger than pizza boxes. The base station equipment, not the antennas, can be up to 28 cubic feet. And then the antennas are limited each to 3 cubic feet, however many there are. So from the FCC's perspective, they define a small cell volumetrically. Now you asked some additional questions about frequency. The FCC doesn't look at frequencies because this is a form factor question. So whether it's operating at 700 megahertz, 5 gigahertz, higher frequencies, then the issue switches over to the second part of your question is getting back again to what I'm a broken record about. Does it comply with the FCC's rules? So in terms of the cumulative effects, that has to be accounted for. The city's rules account for that. But again, if the standard is met, that's the if the federal standard is met, that's the test. So the basic answer to your question is a small cell is a volumetric description, not a service description.
I have to take issue with that. I'm not interested in the physical characteristics of the facility. I want to know the approximate frequencies that would be used in the transmit function, the operating power of the transmitter, and what the effective radiated power of the antenna array would be, and what the cumulative field strength blanket would be, let's say, in 1 square mile. And frequency is very important because, as you said earlier, the frequency and power formula is how the FCC decides what is safe to operate at any given distance from a radiating element. So whether it's 700 megahertz, 400 megahertz, or 2.3 gigahertz, like microwave oven radiation, that's very important. And there are different standards for those frequencies and power levels. So what is a typical frequency and transmit power, and what's the effective radiated power?
There isn't an answer to that question because each cell site is designed to meet the needs of the particular carrier where it's located. Some cell sites will have 600 megahertz deployed on it. Some will have 5 gigahertz. So the answer is there is not an answer. That's completely up to the wireless carriers. That's what they're allowed to do. And just to carry on, because you're absolutely right about the fact that what I said earlier too, is that we're frequency sensitive as people. The frequencies where we are most susceptible to receive, process, absorb RF energy is actually down on the FM band. It's way below what we're talking about for cell phones. So the higher the frequency, actually above 1.5 gig, but out to infinity basically, the FCC says that there's a single standard. But the standard where we are most sensitive to RF is down around the FM band.
Thank you, but I would debate that with you under technical standards at another time. But thank you for that answer.
Thank you.
So I appreciate the information about RF sensitivity and your detailed explanation that helped me understand. You're conveying that we're bags of water. I'm a larger one than most. But what about the birds and the bees? So Mr. Manukian brought that up. Are they just bags of water like us and they're not going to be impacted by this? Or because that to me is the environmental aspect. The health aspect, I understand that we're not allowed to do anything about that, but the environment is important for everyone.
This is a two-part answer. Number one, and I'll use the legal term here, the FCC has field preemption in the area of RF standards, which means Congress has delegated to the Commission sole national authority to set any sort of RF standard. And the FCC has chosen to limit its standards to humans. So there are no standards for non-humans, nor can we as a city create one. It's just, because of preemption, it's off of our plate.
So the environmental impact we should be able to address.
So I heard part of a question about the environmental impact, and you're right. So the Federal Telecommunications Act says local governments shall not regulate the placement of facilities based upon the environmental effects of RF emissions. It says it that plainly.
So we just have to challenge the law. That's what we're going to have to end up doing.
So we actually mentioned that to staff, to the community in, I'm going to say it was 2008, and we gave, someone stood up, actually a young local politician stood up who was campaigning for Brad Sherman and said, call Brad Sherman. Brad Sherman sent the city council a letter saying, you should do something about that. So that's in the record from 2 rounds of regulatory changes. The restrictions on us haven't changed since then, nor has Congress changed the FCC's jurisdiction. There are many cities that are actually challenging, and I don't know that anyone has a tally, But there are numerous cities across the country that are challenging this new order. And so there is one provision regarding one category of fee, which we're suspending because it oversteps, we believe. But that's the new requirement that we're faced with. And there are cities that are taking on this challenge, but the court order just came down a week ago that denied a stay of the FCC order. I think it was a week ago. And so the court said, no, this order is in effect, and the court cases can continue on. So that's the current state of the legal landscape as of February 2019.
I'll give Jonathan kudos on this. His partner, Trip May, is very deeply involved in that litigation. I do want you to know, for those that care, that the League of California Cities is also involved as an amicus party
we
to
represent
that
the
litigation.
league.
Yeah, we represent the league. I review the amicus briefs for the league. They write the amicus briefs for the league, so we're all over it. We're doing everything that we can to fight the FCC's where the FCC has gone with certain facets of this order. And I do want to give acknowledgement to you, sir. You know, your comment was so change the law, and ultimately, you know, I know it's not a satisfactory answer when at a local level people say, yeah, but we're preempted because of what the federal authorities have done. But that's the way it works in America, and because that's the way it works, frankly, the city of Burbank is in large measure in the very same boat as individual citizens of the city of Burbank. Both of them have to look to the superior governmental agencies to make change through a legislative process, if that's what they want to do.
And so, since Jeff gave kudos to Jonathan's partner, I'll give kudos to Jeff. The mere fact that we can regulate aesthetics is in large part to cases that Jeff has tried, which is why he's here. Because I told the council years ago, we can't. And then we brought Jeff in, and Jeff said, well, we can do a little more. So the city really has put its money into pushing the regulations as far as we can go. The city is a member of the league. And it's encouraging to know that the league is still fighting this battle. But we believe we are regulating in a responsible way in the areas that we are currently allowed to regulate.
And I'm sorry, especially for you gentlemen that are in the front, I want to make clear where at least I feel like I'm coming from on all of this. The goal is not to scuttle the ability to deploy 5G. And that's never been the goal. The goal has only been to attempt to harmonize that deployment with local agencies' legitimate interests. And that has been what I've tried to say for years. I am a realist. I understand that a lot of people have a lot of different opinions. But the reality is that when I started working on these things, there were a few cell towers in a few places, and you could text if you knew how to hit 3 times for C and 4 times for Q on your phone, and that was about it. And now, you know, the demand for data is increasing. It's far more substantial than it's ever been before. I used to make fun of it. Now I watch YouTube on my own phone when I have to. In fact, I was watching a parent training video out in the parking lot before I came in here, so that I could volunteer in one of my kids' classes tomorrow. So that's the world that we live in, and the technology that's getting deployed is necessary to feed those demands. That's what's happening. That's my extremely long-winded way of saying, because I want to be clear about this, is that we are not, at least I'm not, against the deployment of 5G. I am for that happening in a way that is harmonized with local interests. That's all.
There's no real demand with the people. I mean, sorry.
So just briefly, and then we'll go to you. So Jeff has mentioned that we're actually not proposing to change our regulations, which is true. What staff is doing is taking, the title of the document is license agreement to attach. We're referring to it actually, and I'll probably change the title before the meeting. It's a master agreement, because what this agreement will do is give carriers a 10-year window to plan their physical deployment in the geographic chunks that make sense for them. And we call those geographic lumps, supplements, and site plans. So the purpose, and Riyadh mentioned the 180-day time limit on approvals. So what the proposed agreement does is it gives the carriers a planning tool to come in and have established rules, submit and identify sites that they want on a first-come, first-served basis. And if they can deploy at those sites within 180 days, they keep them. And if they're a little too ambitious and someone is waiting behind them with an application for that site, we're assuming that there may be a rush. If they can't deploy, then that site would be freed up for someone else that can. And if they can't, then the site would open back up. So really what we're trying to do is create a tool so that staff can work with the carriers for them to deploy as the FCC allows them to. And so
And the state.
And the state, yes, absolutely. Because state law gives them a statewide franchise to conduct their business. It gives them a right to do it in the public right-of-way. And it gives the city the right to regulate reasonable time, place, and manner fairly to all of them. So they all get the same terms. No one gets more favorable terms. And it's up to them to decide how, when, and where within these requirements. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, whose demand are we serving? Who's demanding this? Because the public is not. I've checked online with the Samsung phone, the 5G that's coming up, and 95% of the people said no thank you.
I'll take off. I think it's a fair question, and I think it's an equally fair question whether they should be demanding it, if they are demanding it. But the reality is that we have the Federal Telecommunications Act, which says open up competition, right? And after we had the Federal Telecommunications Act, we got the Middle Class Tax Relief and Jobs Protection Act of 2012, I think, that said open it up some more and go faster. And then we had state legislation that came in that time frame too, that said, oh yeah, us too, we think you should go faster. And at one point the PUC got involved and they said, we think you should go faster. And every time they said, you need to open it up for more competition so there can be more deployment, so that there can be more access. And that has then created opportunities for 2G, then 3G, then 4G, then 5G. And Jonathan can make fun of the G's all he wants. All I know is every time there's a new G, there's twice as many sites per square mile or more. That's what happens. And the reason that there's more sites per square mile is because there's more data demand per square mile. If they could serve a square mile with one antenna and the capital cost of one antenna, they would. But they can't because more people are using more data, which is causing a demand for more sites and faster speeds. That's the reality that's happening. And that trend isn't going away. That's what this FCC report and order is about. Is if it weren't enough to have the 96 Act and the 2012 legislation, now there was an FCC order in 2011, now there's an FCC order in 2018. And it is, I get that there's a certain amount of frustration that comes from you and a skepticism of the demand. I think the demand is real. It's evidenced by the capital investments that the wireless carriers make. There's a huge amount of frustration on the municipal side because every time you think you've got your house in order with regard to your ordinance, here comes a new law from the state or the federal government or a regulatory agency. So I think that was more words per minute than I can usually say.
I think we should have more parks. That's my solution.
I'd like to do a quick survey. How many of you have wired home telephone service? You think you do? No, that's not. That's internet over the top. That's over the top. So, as I was doing my doctoral thesis, I did my doctoral thesis on wireless site deployment. Big surprise. It was around the time in 2016 when the crossover occurred where more people had given up their phone service than actually had phone service at home. So in terms of demand, that's a component to all of this. So it does self-feed, but you can't lose the attorney now. but in terms of demand, We are cord cutters as a nation, more than 50% of the country now, and it increases faster every year. Gives up home phone service for wireless service.
But sometimes the supply creates the demand.
One thing, if I can add, the commercial and residential usage of data can be taken care of via fiber optic, which is a safe alternative, and it supplies as fast, as far as I know, speed that 5G should provide. I know it's more costly, but it is a safer alternative also, and it's more secure.
But without talking about safer, it's pretty hard for us to drive down the street trailing a fiber optic cable or a coax cable.
Well, I talked about fixed structures.
Hang on, I didn't interrupt you. Let me
Right.
give you the full answer here, which is that because we are mobile and we want to have one device that provides our communications, and that's really the reality of it, we don't have people scrambling to add phone service at home, internet service at home. Some of you may have cable TV internet, but more and more, and in fact, wireless 5G, part of 5G is to deploy what's called fixed wireless services, which are essentially a mobile system where when you're at home, you're using the fixed wireless service, which goes back out to the cell site, and then as soon as you leave, it follows you. So just the technology, and you're absolutely right, it can be done. But as a practical matter, it's just not what the public does as a whole anymore. So you're right, but the
Though
reality
if
is
they
the
knew of the
public
health
larger.
risks, maybe they would. Maybe they would elect to. I would. I have a fixed service.
So we don't disagree with you. The state and federal government don't give the city the right to choose what services people buy. So at its core, the federal government reserves for itself the regulation of commerce, generally. And wireless service is a perfect example of where they do not let us force people into choices. Which is why at my house I can switch between Spectrum, and it was Verizon, Fios, and now it's Frontier, and copper, and fiber optic, because the city can't dictate my choices. And so from that perspective, the city has to respond to applications from the regulated industry. And this is our best proposal for the city to be able to respond and meet our obligation to let the carriers roll out their infrastructure. So staff will not be disputing claims of health risks. We're simply not allowed to. There are other entities that are doing that. There are other entities that are challenging further restrictions on local government. We're not. We're simply trying to carry out our obligation, but we do not have the right to choose for the residents of Burbank. I think Jeff mentioned the capital investment. So if the carriers are willing to invest and provide more services, we must figure out how we will let them do that. And that is what staff is bringing to the council. The best way that we can do that without wasting city resources and time and drawing lawsuits.
My question is, does the city get any kind of monetary benefit from this?
So that's a wonderful question. The FCC says not benefit, but cost recovery. So staff has, BWP is expert in identifying what their costs are to provide services. And so in this case, they've gone through their rate-making process, and they have identified both Public Works for traffic signal poles and BWP for replacement streetlights, have identified what their costs are by category and identified a cost-based fee structure. The city's cost to manage and respond to the installations. Now, there was a law that I mentioned earlier that didn't make it into law, the governor vetoed it, it would have allowed the city to separately charge what we believe to have been our right, and that was rent to be on the city pole. But rent is not, specifically not cost-based expressly, and so we have suspended that portion because there's not clear support for it in the FCC order. So, no, there's no monetary benefit to the city, but we are allowed to recoup our costs for reviewing plans and approving permits and helping to manage these installations once they're in a right.
Thank you, Joe. To add to that, if I have your email, if you signed in, and if you've marked yes under electronic documents, I'll send you the agreement, and the fee structure is within the agreement. It's the last couple of pages, so you'll get that as an email.
Minor point, but I'd just like to point out that lack of profit is not lack of benefit. Two different concepts.
And the carriers would agree. They have, for all the categories of their service, they have come to these meetings and they have, will always tell us about the benefits to the citizens and the city generally. And if you're to read any popular tech magazine, they'll tell you that 5G is the fabric that will tie everything smart together. I believe there was even one of the companies telling our chief, our fire chief, that the most efficient way for our emergency vehicles to communicate with each other is over the cellular network. And we probably have police cars that are using similar technology. So there is benefit because we do have vehicles and facilities that communicate wirelessly. And as Jeff and Jonathan mentioned, as the speeds get quicker, it gives more functionality to those emergency response. But it's true the city is a consumer because we require those services to provide services, but this agreement has nothing to do with the city as a consumer of those services. This is how can the city accommodate the right of carriers to deploy their equipment.
I appreciate what you just said, but I think you may have missed what I was trying to get across, which is that, first of all, money flows through government are not automatically, cannot be construed as a benefit simply because the city gets something out of it. What I meant was that the lack of profit, in other words, just cost recovery, doesn't mean that money flows through government don't have some impact. So it's a little bit more of a subtle point. They can't just be answered by saying, well, the city gets this or that service out of it. That's not what I was talking about.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Well, I'm not an engineer or a scientist, but I have done a lot of research on health because my mother passed away from cancer, so that led me to do a lot of research. I know that microwaves are not completely safe, or it may not harm us, but it takes away nutrition from food. RF does cause a lot of harm to the environment, to trees, plants, insects, birds, and with each new generation, 3G, 4G, 5G, it just keeps going up, which means the harms are going to increase. I don't have a computer at home. I don't have Wi-Fi. I never had. I do have a cell phone. I had a landline and I had a cell phone, so I figured, okay, why am I going to be paying for cell phone and landline? So I just have a 4G Galaxy right now. And with every research that I'm doing about 5G and the dangers and RF, and to think about that, my concern is now, how can I escape if towers are going to be every 500 meters, everywhere, schools, residential areas? I'm concerned I don't have a choice anymore. I'm not going to have a choice of escaping RF if I choose not to have 5G. So I've decided I will be opting out of smartphone. I will get a flip phone if I have to. If I can't, if that's not going to work, then I'm going to go back to landline. That's it. I just have to ditch the smartphone. If I can't use 4G, if 5G is going to be deployed everywhere, then that's going to be my decision. And it's great having the smartphone. It does have its benefits. It served well for some time, but again, I don't have that demand where I need it to be faster and faster and faster. Like I have time. I don't want that at the risk of my health. You know, I don't want to become addicted. I don't want children to become addicted, have ADD, HDD, whatever. We have to think about all that. I mean, I don't see you guys as the enemy. I understand you have only so much of the law, you know, on you, but you are human beings. You have children, you have families. I'm sure you have your concerns. And I just think where there's a will, there's a way. And as consumers, we just have to, at some point, say, no, thank you. That's it.
Thank you. Any other questions? Again, I have my contact information up there, as well as business cards over here. Please, if you have any questions, submit an email. I have my phone number up there. In the next meeting, if you'll be showing up, I'll have an FAQ sheet with all the questions and answers that were posted tonight, or as best as we could put it in writing. And we'll also email them out if you have an email in here and you've opted to receive electronic documents. With that, any other comments? Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.